Conversations is William Greider, who is a long-term observer of the situation, political and economic situation from Washington, having reported for the Washington Post and for the Rolling Stone magazine. He's the author of a newly published, just now in April or May of 1992, a book by Simon & Schuster. It's entitled Who Will Tell the People, subtitled The Betrayal of American Democracy. And he is also the major correspondent for a recently broadcast program in the Frontline series for the National Public Television Documentary Consortium called The Betrayal of American Democracy. And we're very happy to welcome him to the program. We began the program this evening by asking him to comment on the fact that the moneyed interest and the special moneyed interest have become so prevalent in terms of setting national policy that it prompted him to refer to Washington as the Grand Bazaar, and we asked him, in an introductory sense, to say, is it the fact that money, which has always been important but has become so especially important now, that politics and the national agenda and the whole democratic agenda now has simply become a matter of very large vested interests and very largely a matter of moneyed interest, and we asked him that question and invited him to respond.
I've been in Washington for 25 years, and there's a certain generation of us, regardless of what we do, who have seen this transpire, and regardless of your politics, you can't not see it over that period of time. Money, of course, has always been money v. people has always been one of the fulcrums of American politics from the beginning, and I say it's always been a struggle between organized money and organized people throughout our history. Where we are now is that the money is very highly organized in a very sophisticated manner, and the people are not organized, and that's a crude way of saying that our basic democratic understandings are not functioning, and people kind of know that. And you could walk out on the street in New York, or believe me, any community in America, rich, poor, white, black, it doesn't matter, have a serious conversation with people in any setting about politics, and sooner or later that will come to the surface, usually sooner.
Yeah, tremendous. Well, I guess alienation is the right term, or tendencies in that direction. 50% of the people don't even bother voting in our presidential elections and so forth. And the discontent is so obvious there. You think that this degree, or is it a quantitative thing, a qualitative change that we've reached this point where we are now in this election year of 1992, where it seems to be at a new level, a high level of discontent? Or has it been the result of the last couple of administrations, or has it been a tendency that's been going all along? Or there have been times when there was the civil rights movement, there was a feisty, sense of democratic participation, or maybe even the realities were such where there really was democratic participation in the governmental and the economic processes.
Yeah, I think.
But is it something qualitative?
Well, it's a series of complicated changes, I think, that are happening simultaneously, but not necessarily connected to one another, that have produced this. And it didn't start this year. It actually didn't start with Ronald Reagan. Right. My liberal friends don't like to hear that, but that's the truth of the matter. It's spread over really the last generation, and let me list a couple of those things. One, the political parties, which, as we know, were never perfect vessels of representing people anyway, but they lost their capacity to mediate between citizens at large and the government. And sometimes they did that crudely and for rather narrow-minded purposes, but you can't have known what politics was like in a lot of cities 25, 30 years ago without understanding that a lot of very ordinary people got their sense of connection to government through the local political organization.
Down to the ward level.
That's right, down to the and as we showed in the Frontline documentary, we went back to Louisville, where I had worked as a young reporter in the 60s, and into a neighborhood called Germantown. These wonderful folks, they really hadn't changed that much, and just talking to people and going into the barbershop, and they all had the same feeling of, yeah, the Democratic Party, I wish it still was here.
Yeah.
And well, what did you get out of it? Well, they'd come around and knock on your door and talk to you, and you felt like you mattered.
Yeah, and you were connected.
And yes, if you were out of work, they'd help you find a job, and maybe it would be a city hall job, or maybe it would be somebody's garage or whatever. Yeah. But I mean, political parties, especially the Democratic Party, used to do that at a very humble level.
And connected it with the name of an individual. You know, they would know.
No, they knew. They remembered Miss Lenny, who was the legendary boss at that point.
And that was a personal connection and a sense of connectedness to it.
And then the other level of that, which is also described more fully in my book, is that, again, quite imperfectly, nobody is claiming that we once had perfection and it is now lost, but a party organization gave a place for people to go to hold public officials accountable. And Lud Ashley, who was a congressman from Toledo for 25, 30 years, and a liberal Democrat who is now head of a major bank trade association. I mean, he's with the biggest banks in the country, and a close personal friend of George Bush. So this is not an anti-establishment character, right? But he's an honest politician, and he was talking about the experience as a young congressman going back to Toledo and having to go to the ward meeting, the ward chairman's meeting once a month, or the precinct meetings, and getting into a dialogue not about who was cleaning the streets, but about public policy issues. And he tells this vivid story of how they brought him to ground on the war in Vietnam. He was pro-Johnson, he was pro-war, he was a good patriotic Cold Warrior.
And they were right.
And he started going to these meetings, and they started yelling at him, and he said they practically drove me out of the hall. And he said, I said, well, did you change your mind? He said, I had to change my mind if I was going to run for re-election, because this is accountability. That's what accountability means. Now, my question is, where does that happen in our society now?
Right.
And the answer is almost nowhere.
Yeah, right. And he also said in your documentary, he said that I had to realize, I really changed my mind. I came to realize these people were right and I was wrong. And and he had a sense of, I don't know what the term is, but at least he's not hubris. It wasn't hubris, it was the opposite of that, of accepting that the people had some wisdom and some.
And when you think about it, that is the essence of democracy, and why, if it is functional, democracy should produce better government. Because what you're doing is taking in lots of eyes and ears. You're not just listening to a cadre of highly educated experts who are looking basically at numbers, not at real life. You're at least filtering into the system the millions of voices, experiences, and so forth, and trying to figure out how does their idea of reality fit with government policy. And that's an important discipline. And the further the government gets away from that sort of discipline, the more likely it is to go plunging over various cliffs, as the government seems to do quite regularly.
With their hubris intact, or flying high, like that sort of thing. And we do that. Now, if we were to do this in generational terms, or to say 20, 30 years or so, how can we account for this? Why do we account for this? Can we talk, some people have said that we do have, to a considerable degree, we have a political democracy in the sense that everyone over 18 does have a right to vote. I guess they can't. They vote less and less. What is it, 50%?
That's a pretty thin idea of what democracy means.
No. But I mean, even at that, 50% of those people don't vote in presidential elections.
Actually fewer.
I think we had 7% in the New York primary that voted here, so it's very small. There's a turn. But that we have very much, our society is obviously, and there was a piece in the New York Times today, the Federal Reserve figures came out, that we are very, very much in the United States an economic plutocracy, have been and are continuing, and the trending is that direction, that the wealth and the capital wealth and the capital assets are very, very narrowly held, and probably the vast majority of the people don't even think of terms of having any ownership of capital instruments or anything of that sort. It's very much of an economic plutocracy. Is that reality beginning to get the fact that the economics are so concentrated, the wealth, that is beginning to catch up with the political process, or is there a relationship between those?
I think I'm ever the optimist, but I wouldn't be terribly sanguine about current events as a change in these deep patterns. One of the things that happened, we lost the political parties in their connective function. Simultaneously, the federal government took on a lot of obligations that it hadn't really tried to fulfill before, most dramatically the environmental regulation. That gave corporate America a very direct incentive to bring a lot of money to Washington, which they did, starting really in the early 70s.
After the Clean Air Act?
And Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, OSHA of protecting workers' safety. I mean, there's a long list of reforms, all of which grew out of the reform movements of the 60s and early 70s. And those were landmark laws. However, they gave corporations a very powerful incentive to unify their politics. Throw their money together into think tanks that would churn out policy reports and propaganda. Form coalitions of lobbyists that would work a tax bill or an environmental bill, or etc. Hire lots and lots of lawyers, scientists, economists, all of experts, all of whom would be focused not just at the legislative process, but at the regulatory process, where much of what gets passed as law gets undone, and, very important, public education and propaganda. And you step back some evening and watch television and see how many messages are directed at the American public every evening that basically say, GE is a wonderful company. IBM takes care of children in the ghetto. Weyerhaeusen plants trees. Dow Chemical takes idealistic young people and sends them off to protect the environment. And when I try, the SEALs are applauding for, is it Exxon or Chevron? I mean, and if you know the record of these same companies in despoilation of the environment, and in fact ignoring laws, not just now and then, but year after year after year,
regulatory process.
In that same,
they pass what you call hollow laws.
I mean, they manipulate this process. I mean, it makes one gag a bit when you see the conflict, which I describe quite directly in my book. And here's the good part of this story. On the whole, I think most Americans don't really quite swallow the message.
No, I think probably at a certain level they certainly don't.
At a deeper level they don't. But all of those things, all of the propaganda and public education and all of the lobbyists they have this effect, I think. They build a fence around the debate. They confine the public dialogue to a kind of limited set of ideas that are acceptable, and you're outside that fence. That's all of that same apparatus turns on you and says, that's an unacceptable idea. That's radical. That's dangerous. Well, you know, they have a whole set of words that are applied to people like myself beyond
to increasing numbers of people too.
That's right. No, I mean you don't have to be very radical to get that label.
I'm not radical. God bless you for that.
Well, I'm not a radical in any historic sense of the word.
But you would say the truth.
I'm arguing out of what are literally supposedly the shared values of the society.
Absolutely.
If we can asking the sort of basic questions. All right. Democracy means we have accountability. Do we have accountability? You couldn't get 10% of the American people to say yes, absolutely. Another important value of our democracy is equal protection of the law. Do you believe the government enforces the law equally and that we're all pretty much treated the same?
No.
You have a hard time getting a crowd to support that.
Not if you're talking about the people as opposed to these organized and well-financed, moneyed interests that have an a focus. They've become more adept at focusing the attention on the lobbying effort than they had been historically.
The numbers of representatives and lawyers who are kind of go both ways as a lawyer, lobbyist. They can both litigate and lobby.
Yeah.
Has grown at least tenfold over the last 20 years.
It figures
Probably
200
more
to
than-
2,000 or something like
and,
that.
it's even larger than that, really.
Yeah. And the amounts of money that they begin to put into
And if anybody
this.
who goes to Washington now and remembers it from the 60s,
Yeah.
I think will be most struck by the affluence of the city.
Yeah.
I mean, it looks a little like some of the gilded areas of New York City, right?
It's like the Gilded Age,
Yeah.
right? Or Phillips has written about that. You know, the concentration of the wealth and that sort of thing. And then it's developed like that. And the result, as far as the broad citizenry is concerned, is they feel very much left out of this political
and it has
process.
another
Or there's a degree of-
insidious effect on the people in the governing community itself.
Yeah.
And I mean even the good people who really do want to try to keep their minds open to the big picture.
Yeah.
I mean, you
Much less
can't,
justice,
you can't live in a milieu
Yeah.
of sort of fancy restaurants and all of the other perks and everything else without somehow absorbing that in your social vision.
Yeah,
And I make the argument, and this will offend a lot of good people in Washington, but I really believe it's true, that inevitably that warps their ability to see the larger social reality.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I didn't use this.
yeah.
I heard a conversation once with some people who were congressional aides in financial regulation, and they were talking about IRAs. And they were sitting around, and they didn't have the numbers before them, so they were sitting around arguing about whether, well, what do you think the average size of the IRA of an American family is? And then one thought, well, probably 25,000, and another thought, well, no, it's much lower than that. It's probably 5,000 or 10,000.
Yeah.
And of course, as most people could tell them, most Americans don't have an IRA.
Well, all these ads that are on television.
And most Americans are debtors.
Right.
No, they're not. They don't have savings, even $5,000 in savings.
And all these ads about, well, you could switch to another broker because if that broker doesn't have you right,
who are they talking to?
Who the heck are they talking to except a few?
But you see what I'm getting
people.
at.
But the ads are all directed at this very elite few, and those people become the elite few, if I would suggest, to a considerable degree, because they own the capital, they own the money. We're moving toward a two-class society, or are we? Is that
well,
is
I
it true
think
to say,
and
then the attacks upon labor. I mean, the PAPCO. We just had the Caterpillar thing; was very disappointing. That was another mediating agency. But
and I deal with those in the book in I hope original ways. But
yes, you do
I
indeed.
have a couple of chapters essentially about labor and what happened to it. And I am as steeped as anybody in the critique of labor's leadership and what unions did wrong and so forth. But that story has been told amply over the last 20 years and has strong elements of truth to it. But what gets left out is that the labor movement first was the progressive core of our politics. It lent its weight to every other important cause, from the civil rights movement to the environmental movement, consumer movement. None of those landmark laws would likely have become reality if it had not been for labor putting its shoulder to the wheel.
Organizing the people against the owners and the bosses.
That's the whole idea,
the
collective power of people. Secondly, while labor contributed no doubt to its own decline, its decline really was driven by two things. One is the global economy, which is eroding the industrial unions, which were the core of the labor movement.
You treat of that so well in the last chapter, or the second last chapter of your book.
And we'll get to that. But the other cause is the law itself. And people do not appreciate that Americans today do not have the rights to organize collectively in their own behalf and get representation with their employer that they had 30 or 40 years ago. Those rights have been gradually circumscribed, eroded, manipulated, and twisted. And so that, you saw it just recently in the Caterpillar strike of the UAW out in the Midwest, but it happens on a recurring basis. And whenever labor goes into the political arena, as it's doing now, and tries to get even very modest reforms to restore its legal rights, not everybody turns away, but in general, even a lot of Democrats who, after all, get a lot of money from labor, sort of shy away as though that's such an unfashionable cause.
Yeah,
they can't be bothered with.
Yeah, it is. Well,
so I mean, in a way, my argument is say,
it's very pessimistic.
let's go back to fundamentals here. If the Democrats or anybody else say they are protecting working people, then they've got to help labor unions get back the capacity to organize those people. And that's not a popular idea at this time in our history, as you know.
It hasn't been.
But and then the second half of that is the global economy. If you talk to, say, auto workers in the Midwest, or steel workers, and a good many other manufacturing workers, they are portrayed usually as these sort of know-nothing protectionists. You know, they want to tear up the Japanese car, and so forth. The reality I have seen is that people who work in plants that are competing in the global economy are real smart about it, very sophisticated. They know the price realities around the globe. They know exactly who their competitors are in different markets. And they understand what most Americans don't quite yet understand, which is that this global trading system, unregulated, unfettered, is a system running downhill, and it's gradually pulling down our wage levels, but it's also pulling down our laws, and that is, literally our national sovereignty is being eroded by this system.
In the name of competitiveness.
In the name of the United States if the United States wants to impose these standards on corporations, whether it's taxes, environmental law, worker safety, child labor, things we thought were settled a long time ago.
That national entity and go international.
They'll move the factory to Mexico
in the name of
or Indonesia, or whatever, in the name of efficiency.
Yeah, right. And competitiveness.
And competitiveness.
Yeah, right.
And every nation, including the United States, is losing its ability to establish its own social standard.
Why hasn't that been the case throughout the history, or has it been the case throughout the history of the capitalist experiment? And has there been? Is it just that it's becoming more efficient to move capital? Is transportation improved so that they can, take advantages of these kind of things? Whereas in 50 years ago, where the coal was important and the transportation wasn't so well developed. Why is it that they're able to do this?
The pattern today, the pattern we're experiencing now in the global economy is actually quite consistent with the history of capitalism. And capitalist development, including especially the industrial age and revolution, has always had a pattern of breaking forward to new technologies, new capacities, and doing that in a highly exploitative manner. If you go back and spend a little time in eastern Kentucky, which I have as a reporter, coal and steel and timber did to eastern Kentucky what modern corporations are now doing to Mexico or other third world countries. And the history of politics has always been that sooner or later people have to become sufficiently outraged and aware of this process to then impose social values on business.
They used to let kids work 12 hours. They tried to get it back to
a
kid under 8 didn't even have to work but 12 hours a day, and that sort of thing. And child labor was just back to Dickens' days.
You don't have to go back to Dickens. You can go back to the life of this city 80 years ago.
Yeah, right, okay.
And in lower Manhattan, the children worked, and it was said that if you wouldn't let the children work, why the economy would collapse.
That's beginning to happen in this city now with some of the immigrants who are really just nothing but almost slave labor. Not to mention the workers in China and other kinds of places that are literally under conditions that will amount to real, honest-to-God wage slavery.
This is not a moral judgment about corporations and business. It really isn't. It's a historical judgment that they will always break to new, higher ground and do. And I mean, that's the nature of a corporate enterprise.
Yeah,
until, whether it's church or government or social movements, talk back to them and say, wait a minute, this is wrong.
And that ought to be some governmental involvement in terms of that, if you're going to have any kind of organized something by the people against these vested and powerful
And
interests.
what's happened really in the last 30 years is that new technologies of communication, transportation, so forth, computers, allowed a high mobility of capital. You can close a factory in Indiana and put up a new one in Mexico or Indonesia quite simply, and more importantly, you can manage this global network of production and development and retailing efficiently. You couldn't do that 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago.
Well, 100 or 50, that's what I was wondering, whether you could, because of the inefficiency. I mean, remember they used to give the stock market things with carrier pigeons and things. I mean, you know, the technology has made it so that it's interlinked, the economies are, but it's still a matter of, I mean, you're an economist and so forth. I mean, how much of the overall, if I could, maybe it's an irrelevant question if it is, say so, you know, but how much of the productive cost of producing goods and services in the modern world economy is labor related, and how much of it is increasingly technology, and are they getting such advantages by paying, rather than $5 or $7 or $10 an hour, $1 an hour, and is that labor question such a critical one in terms, as they would try to argue, in terms of these economic costs, marginal cost factors and so forth?
Yeah, well, we could answer that.
Or should we have some experts?
We could answer
that,
but it doesn't matter how we answer it.
Right, okay, yeah, right, okay.
It only matters how the corporate numbers crunchers, as they call them, answer it.
And they'll give it to us on TV.
And they are going to say, yes, there's certain things wrong in Mexico. Among others, they have no roads and they don't have modern plumbing in a lot of places and so forth. But if we move to Mexico, guess what? We don't pay any property taxes.
Yeah, right. We don't have to watch OSHA.
We can get the government to give us a 50-year lease for nothing. And we can pay the workers, and this is true, this is literally true, the equivalent of 55 cents an hour. Now, we have these workers in Indiana or Ohio or Illinois, and we're paying them $9.50 an hour or $11 an hour. And now, here's the killer. In fairness to those corporate decision makers, they will say to themselves ultimately, we don't want to abandon those people in Illinois, but if we don't do it, our competitor is going to do it. So let's just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, right.
That's where, that's the point. And I'm saying that quite sincerely, that it's too easy to say, well, if we had decent Americans running these companies, they wouldn't do that to us. They're caught too. They're caught in this global trading system. And everybody is fighting for the price advantage. And they have to fight too, or sooner or later they'll be rolled.
It's all moving to some lowest common denominator. And the arguments that they would make is, well, eventually they will be brought up, and that we're going to have a leveling of the. They try to take a democratic role.
No, they will make the argument that capitalist apologists have always made, which is, this is a wealth-producing process, as indeed it is, and in the long run, this wealth will accumulate and allow more investment and it will be distributed eventually, so that in the long run everyone will benefit. And you know, of course, John Maynard Keynes' famous riposte to that.
We're all dead.
In the long run, we're all dead.
Right.
And of course, that's he wasn't being facetious about that. It is not an answer to people to say, well, you're losing your standard of living, and your children are going to lose their standard of living, but 50 or 100 years from now, the world is going to be better off. And you have to accept your condition. That's not an answer that any human being should have to accept. And in fact, the way out, I think, and I grant that it's very difficult and will take years of political action from lots of different people, but the way out is for people in this country to see the mutuality of their political interests with people on the other end of the transmission belt, that is in places like Mexico and so forth, and begin to build new standards for the global trading system.
International standards.
Impose them on. I mean, there isn't a government probably anywhere in the world that will take the lead in that at the present moment. They're all trapped in the same competition.
There's no.
That is trying to roll over to whoever will put a factory in their territory.
If we could put
and only the stronger countries, namely the United States, have the base of prosperity to be able to say, look, we're going to start imposing some rules. If you want to trade in this market, it is the largest market in the world, you're going to have to start accepting these rules. And that applies not just to Japanese or German companies, it applies to American companies.
That would have to be done at a governmental level, nearly.
Yeah,
I
sure.
mean, yeah, and so, and where are we going to find the political strength, given the kind of weak performance of our labor unions and other kinds of democratic institutions? Although, as you say in your book and in the documentary piece, there's beginning to be so much alienation, so much, you know, at the common sense, everyday level, so much reaction to this, that there may be building up an ability for the people to, in a certain sense, to, I don't know, take back the democracy or ask the right questions.
I guess I'm an optimist, first because of American history. You can go through American history, as you know, and find even more daunting moments, and the people eventually broke out of them, not with perfect fulfillment, but they did get their act together. Secondly, I think that the political status quo is much more vulnerable than conventional wisdom holds. If vulnerable, that is, to a really organized assault from people outside it. And by that I mean people getting organized in some continuing way. They can't just come together in the second week of April for the New York primary and expect that to change the world. That's, you know, it's kind of silly and simple-minded to believe that. But if they begin to build connections with other people and demonstrate that they are there for the long run, then challenge the status quo, then you could, I mean, again, this may be wishful thinking on my part, but I have a sense that that the present order is very vulnerable to that kind of intrusion. And I think really, before we get to any of these difficult questions like how do you take on the global economy, people first have to demonstrate that they are willing to destabilize the status quo. And whether they do that within a party or outside of it as third parties or as you know, Ross Perot style insurgencies. I don't feel like I need to choose among the routes that people
or
might
if they
get
do
there.
it with hard-biting and really relevant TV documentaries.
Right. Well, that doesn't hurt.
Yeah, right.
That won't change the world
No, but
either.
it is important in a certain sense. The communications, if there's some alternative ways, alternative ideas, could be got into the media, because the media is increasingly powerful and important. Television particularly, I think, don't you? I mean, in my experience.
And television,
it almost has a quasi-political function.
Television is one of, and now probably the most important political channel available.
And it's all controlled and owned by relatively few people. Ben Bagdikian has shown that the mainline media is very, very carefully, is very narrowly held and becoming ever more narrowly held by, again, the same big vested money interest people who own the wealth, and which the Federal Reserve reports to us now has increasingly become more and more that those who own the wealth are getting more and more of the wealth, have gotten more and more of the wealth.
And as you said, the ownership of the mechanisms of communication is becoming highly concentrated.
Along with everything else.
Along with everything else. Television is paradoxical because, on the one hand, it's elitist in its technology. I mean, it takes a studio and train people to produce a television, and it takes lots of money to get the equipment and so forth. On the other hand, it's relentlessly populist. The images speak very directly to people, and you don't have to have a PhD to understand.
That's right.
Everybody
and
can,
it picks up nuance.
And it tells truths. That's right. It tells truths that the people who are on screen don't realize are being told about things. So I have, on balance, and acknowledging that television did a lot to destroy political institutions like political parties and accountability, I'm basically an optimist about the medium. I think it has the seeds to make people powerful again, including their ability to produce their own television. And that's where public access television is. I hope. I hope a harbinger of what lies ahead. I mean, just take...
And we begin to have this deep dish, which is a thing where these people, a collection of activists and people who are concerned around the country, who are also trying to begin to tap into the realities of satellite distribution, which is the economic reality.
That's very exciting to me.
And they're doing it at just a local level and beginning to get something going, because that's fighting against, in a certain sense, the big interests. And it's indicative also, if I may, of the fact that you have a great number of channel capacities, which in a metaphor sense represents, in a certain metaphor sort of sense, if I may, the fact that the emerging technologies and the technologies of the time in which we find ourselves, one of the frustrating aspects of the contemporary human condition is that we do have a knowledge base and a technological capability of answering the ancient scourges of the human condition that is unprecedented. It's almost abundant in what we have, and we have these political things that are getting in the way. Do you understand what I mean?
No, I agree completely.
The access it has a certain abundant quality that these cable systems have that is perhaps a harbinger or a metaphor for a broader metaphor for the economy.
I argue in the book, and I know that this goes against the supposed scientific evidence, but I've seen this over my lifetime. People in this country are basically smart, but they are also much better informed than they're given credit for. And I attribute that to television. It's true they may not have their knowledge sort of neatly lined up the way a political reporter would, or
an academic
would.
Test taker.
Exactly, that's right.
Yeah.
But I've done this again and again. You go into the most remote corners of America and talk to people who are very humble in their lives.
Yeah.
And you find yourself talking to them about the same big public issues that you talk about in New York or Washington.
And they know very jolly well what they're talking about.
They have a very clear idea of what the argument is about.
Yeah.
They may not know all of the fine print facts, but they understand what the
also
argument is.
It's a thing,
and that's television. That isn't. There isn't.
I think so. Yeah. It's also a thing in psychology, figuring ground that there is a wealth of knowledge. If there's an appropriate pattern put there, they can recognize that pattern is appropriate. I think it might bespeak why your series is getting such a wide response. People understand that which they're doing.
Well, and as you know, it did not get a totally friendly response in elite circles.
No, but the elite, they shouldn't be. The elite should be questioned.
The New York Times,
the elite should be
quite
questioned.
hostile.
The elite should be questioned, and the elite should be questioned because, we've had an industrial revolution for 300 years. The human species has been on the earth for 200,000 years. We have this incredible technological productive capability intrinsic to the contemporary moment as we move into it. The computer chip continues to just go through revolution after revolution, almost on a yearly basis in terms of the ability to use information. We have this tremendous capability, and we still have poverty in our midst. Something is not right in the way in which this system is operated from a comprehensive view, and they jolly well should be challenged.
As I end the book, those things you're talking about are political questions. They are not economic questions. Well, they're economics in the sense that economics confines the answers to them. But the hunger and starvation is the easiest one. There is no physical restraint now on feeding everybody in the world.
Absolutely.
Not to mention everybody in this country.
Absolutely.
You can, and think of that in terms of human history. We are literally living at the very first era in human history where you could say that.
Yes, that's right.
100 years ago, 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, the economic struggle for most of the world was literally a struggle of survival.
Hard, honest to God scarcity.
Can we get enough to feed our children?
Hard, honest to God.
And that went on and on and on, year after year.
Scarcity. Hard scarcity.
Right. Now we know, because of all of these technological changes that have occurred and development of different societies, we have a paradox where it is not just that some of us are wealthy and some of us in the world are very poor. The world is awash in surplus food.
Absolutely. Not only surplus food, surplus capacity. We have surplus capacity of providing for the people of the world.
If we use that capacity, we only create more surplus because we can't. Those other because of the political economic arrangements, we have not figured out how to distribute that food to people who need it.
That's right. And we have it endlessly going to those who already are wealthy, endless credit capability, endless capability to do more and more. They can't possibly buy it. They can't possibly eat but so many filet mignons, and so you endlessly going. And we have this thing.
But if you're an optimist about human history, and I am, that makes this period of history very exciting.
Oh, well, absolutely.
Because it means, well, if
Chinese
people,
warned against living in exciting times, you know.
Well, if people put their values in motion in politics, that's a solvable problem. I mean, we can't sit here and lay out every piece of it, but we know that that's as opposed to some people must starve because there ain't enough food to go around.
Yeah, to just take that as a given and to all the precepts. But I mean, economics, some have said economics is the science of the allocation of scarce resources. What would we do if we ever reached a point where 5+ billion people in the world now, apparently if we first appeared 200,000 years ago? It's really interesting. The human species first appeared. We're all descended of one person. We reach a point where we have these number of people, and we have the capacity, apparently for the first time, to render the planet incapable of the continuation of the species with the destructive aspects of technological just weapons
it's like a foot race between those two possibilities.
It'd be like we come to a time, as you say, of perhaps of really truly qualitative transformation. Another metaphor might be we've been gestating for 200,000 years, and we reach a point where we really must not study war no more, must not study the history-bound paradigms for which we've organized ourselves, and we need new ones, and they're not coming from the leadership. And the people sense that we're heading for disaster. It's like hard labor, perhaps, and that we may be coming into some sort of a new capability that could be really, I don't like to use an overworked term, liberating or transformative at a time in which we live. But they don't come up with those answers, right? Or we don't, collectively.
But look, here's the hopeful way of stating what you just said.
Okay, good, do, please.
Those answers never come from the top.
Yeah, right, all right.
They never have in human history. Right. So the encouraging factor
they're too comfortable.
That, as you know, why would they want to change the status quo?
Right.
It has to always come up from the bottom. That's the democratic idea.
Right.
And because, among other things, I make the point a dozen different ways throughout the book. And of course, it challenges the central prejudice of Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
The reality is, people distant from power, who may be in very ordinary, humble circumstances, can see reality more clearly than experts frequently. And I give lots of different examples of that.
Right.
But, I mean, and that's not just a sort of sweethearted cliche about working people. It's true. I give the most striking example. If you go back to the 50s or 60s, people in various parts of this country began talking vaguely about a cancer epidemic. And they attributed to various things, some of them nutty, but the main explanation was, well, all these chemicals in our environment, pollution and in food we eat and so forth and so on. And the scientific opinion almost unanimously dismissed that as unfounded fear. And of course the political order and the media and everybody said there's nothing to that, there's absolutely no evidence.
The fear of the uninformed rabble.
You people have read Rachel Carson and you're overactive in your fear.
You don't understand it at all.
They were right. At that moment there was no scientific evidence.
Right.
But here we are 30 years later and the scientific evidence comes in every year. There is a cancer epidemic. Rising cancer rates, excluding lung cancer, which is mostly attributable cancer, and what is most outrageous, rising cancer rates among children. And they don't yet know, in a, quote, scientific manner, the exact explanation for this, but some of the authors of these studies have said, in a speculative way, well, it's probably environmental pollution because it seems to be concentrated in industrial nations and in industrial areas and so forth. My only point is, here is this certitude that science and politics and government offered to people 30 years ago, and corporate America, of course, and the people said, well, it doesn't feel that way to us, and the people were right in that argument. And we now have an area in the southwest, Louisiana, Texas Gulf Coast, which is literally, they call Cancer Alley.
Good God, really? Yeah, right.
And nobody argues anymore as to why that's so. It's because all those mills and refineries down there are spewing poison in the air.
Yeah.
This, incidentally, and this is another theme of my book, as you know, that's been against the law since 1970.
Yeah, well,
how could they get away with it?
You have this very interesting concept where they pass hollow laws, where they talk to the issues that people feel, and then in the regulatory process, and you had a piece with Lloyd Cutler, I think, where he says it's the interpretation of that, they can just bargain all of that away, and they can manipulate it away with the power. And again, it comes back to the fact that the money interest are so very powerful in the terms by which money and interest of the business world and the economic conditions are so set up. You had written, I don't want to backtrack from the book or anything like that, but you had put a great deal of attention to a very, very, very important book called Secrets of the Temple, How the Federal Reserve Runs the Country. Yeah. And I wondered maybe you could just briefly touch on that. Here's this other book, and we might as well say it's still in print,
still
recommended reading. It's 900 and 700 pages of detailed information about the Federal Reserve Board, which I would venture to say 99.99999% of the people have very little inclination of the importance of that.
2% now.
And, okay. And what? Maybe you could talk a little bit. Could you mention it? And what does it mean?
I was a reporter at the Washington Post before I joined Rolling Stone, and did a lot of wrote a piece that won some notoriety called "The Education of David Stockman," which was a sort of unveiling of the effects of the Reagan tax cuts and budget decisions back in 1981, and produced the deficits which we are living with still today. But I knew at the time I did that article that what David Stockman was doing and what Ronald Reagan was doing with the budget was actually only half of the story and not the most important half. Yeah. What Paul Volcker was doing at the Federal Reserve has as much or more to do with what happened to the American economy in the 1980s, including what is happening to us right now, than the elected side of government. So I set out to write a book about that, and it took me longer than I anticipated, 4 or 5 years. And it's quite long, but I have to say it's very satisfying to me to know that the wonderful thing about a book is that it takes a commitment from both sides. I mean, to write one, you really have to make a commitment.
Absolutely.
And if it's a long, serious book, to read it, you have to make a commitment. So I still hear from lots of people around the country who have just read that book. And have questions or reactions or something. And that's a very, very satisfying experience. And I hope the same happens with this book, not necessarily tomorrow or the next day, although obviously I hope it sells well. But the wonderful thing about a book is that it's on the shelf and you don't know who's going to pull it down 5 or 10 years from now and learn something from it.
But we have these Federal Reserve banks, 12 of them around the country, and they're privately owned. They're part of a private banking system. In a certain sense, the democratic or the democratic control of a Congress over the terms of interest, the terms by which the economy is to be operating, these very, very important questions to a certain degree. Have we given up any democratic control over that and handed over a great deal of the control of the terms by which business is going to operate in this country to people who have a very conflict of interest, a vested interest in terms of handing it over to the banking industry itself? It's sort of like Mr. Woods, Charles Woods, who is running for president now as a Democratic. We did an interview. He said it's a little bit like sending the fox out to watch over that hen house, or not. I mean, if you could
maybe more like sending the bear out to
the bear to watch the hen house. That's even worse. But I mean, it is something we should be aware of as far as
it's
contributing mightily to this concentration of wealth.
It's an expression of the ignorance of contemporary Americans that most people do not understand the Federal Reserve and why it is central to their lives.
And we should, and it's important in gross qualitative terms that we understand
absolutely. And people in the 19th century,
a big issue,
understood money. They understood the regulation of money and how important it was to them, and that knowledge has been lost. Not totally by accident, I must say, because citizens in this century have been educated to defer to authority. And the Federal Reserve, which is mostly economists and bankers, is the ultimate authority. It's secret. You can't see what they do at their meetings.
That's right.
And yet it makes decisions mainly about interest rates that ripple through the economy with a certainty that presidential declarations do not.
Yeah, incredible.
The reason we are in recession now, the reason we have this recession is because the Federal Reserve in 1988, in the middle of the presidential election, started kicking up interest rates. And they kicked them up nearly double, and they held them up there for about a year and a half. And it's true they started bringing them down, but it was too late. The economy was in recession. The Federal Reserve has made some profound mistakes in its management over the last 2 or 3 years, and we are in various forms of crisis because of that. And I mean, that's the simplest, most direct argument as to why it should be opened up and democratized. We don't have a voice there.
Yes, sir. And you're talking here about something that really has a major effect as far as and we can talk about check kiting and little things like that. You understand what I'm saying? This is a major issue.
Absolutely.
Another one you talk about is the savings and loan, right? And that in 1988, in the election, that they held off giving the worst notification of the savings and loan. And you have in your documentary and in your book a very disquieting fact that $70 billion now, something like 6% of our national government has been earmarked for the FDIC, and that there might be a danger for the commercial bank. I wonder if you could maybe that's another seeming big issue.
I'm making this prediction, and I may be wrong, but I'm fairly confident of it.
Incredible development.
Voters woke up right after George Bush's inaugural to discover what they had not been told during the campaign or in the years before, which is that they were liable for several $100 billion to clean up the ruined savings and loan industry. I predict that next year, whether Bush is back or Bill Clinton is in the White House, they are going to be told, it may take a few months, but eventually they will be told, by the way, you're going to have to pay for the commercial banks too. And if we are unlucky, the cost of the commercial banks, in theory, might be even larger than the S&Ls. I hope it doesn't get that bad.
Good Lord.
But I'll just tell you a few things now. The answer to people...
I mean, to bail out the bankers... and what could be done with those billions of dollars in terms of the social agenda and need?
You see,
$10,000 repair in Chicago resulted in $1 billion loss of commerce and whatnot. I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to...
Well, see, here's one of the ironies of our time, which is very difficult for people to face. The FDIC, the insurance, deposit insurance system, was created in 1933 by Democrats at the dawn of a great era of reform. Savings and loan deposit insurance system, likewise, was a creation of liberals who wanted to spread housing in this country, and for 30 or 40 years, both of those systems worked. Now they have been so corrupted that they are serving an opposite purpose. But it's very hard for, quote, reformers of our time to stand back and say, wait a minute, I know this came out of the New Deal, but look at the results it's producing. We have to rethink bank regulation. We have to rethink housing and how we get housing to people in this
Gonzalez
country. Henry Gonzalez, as you know, is one of my heroes. And he's a deep thinker, and he's tried to get people to come to grips with this. But all I'm getting at is it's not just as easy as beating up on bankers and right-wing politicians, although I do that. That won't get you there.
No, you want to try and understand how in the hell
You've got to look at the
thing.
system that was created by liberals and ask, okay, these are now barriers to democracy. How can we reform them?
How can we reform them, and how can we begin to recapture something of the sense of participation by the citizens that is really woefully lacking now, and appropriately so, given the realities of this grand bazaar, as we say, it's eroded. So, again, and that the money interests have come in. But you touch on two of those major big issues in the whole ones. You say you're optimistic. You have in your piece and in the book these groups of people down in Texas where they begin to get together. The man even avoided politics. They even avoided politics. And one of the women, in one of the speeches to this group of people of Chicanos, I guess, or Mexican Americans, got together and she said, we don't want a representative democracy, we want a participatory democracy, a sense of participation in the ongoing process of this country. That's an important theme.
Well, let me talk about that a moment, because
we're running short on time.
Okay, well, that's called the Industrial Areas Foundation.
Yeah.
They have a network of 10 groups in Texas. They have a group in East Brooklyn, Queens, starting in the South Bronx.
All right. Yeah.
They have developed ways to allow poor people, working class people, to build their own political organizations.
Right, right.
They do not create an instant millennium in politics, obviously.
No, no.
But they're giving something, a real place for people to come to form their political agendas, and then to confront the people in power with that agenda.
Maybe try to do it outside of that agenda, or that mainline agenda.
Exactly, and it gives them,
because it's so hopeless.
It gives them not only the freedom to say what it is they see about the reality, but also it gives those people self-realization. I mean, I think people have forgotten that politics is a way of realizing yourself, partly by building relationships with other people.
Right.
And we look at formal politics. That's gone. I mean, it's a joke. There's manipulation and deceit and big money and all the rest. So my single message is it's not an easy one for people to swallow, but you can make politics real again for yourself and fulfilling, and maybe get power, but you got to do it yourself. Nobody's going to do it for you.
A sort of feisty, I don't know, use anarchism, but a feisty kind of participation by the part of individuals, a kind of, I don't know what the term, populist kind of attitude toward the society which built the society in the first place, in a sense. Frontier spirit, ability for people to do things, and
it's
to do
not,
strike
it's
out.
A very American quality.
It's all American quality like that. You know, and we've also, just one last thing I'd like to touch on, we've got 1 minute or so, this idea of the concentration of ownership, 37, maybe 40% of the assets owned. The idea, quickly, you give general a credence to the degree it can be worked out, of Louis Kelso's idea of trying to build ownership, even difficult as it is within the last minute.
Louis Kelso, as you know, had what he called, like to call, a model for saving capitalism from its own excesses.
We're trying to spread ownership.
And that was to build. In the 19th century, land was the property base of our economy. Now it's stock ownership and financial assets. So what he was devising is mechanisms by which workers, communities, people in the society at large can share, not by taking wealth away from somebody who has lots of it, but share equitably in the distribution of the new wealth that is created by our economy.
And have opening to credit to buy
and they need
things
credit
that will pay for themselves over a reasonable period of time to build ownership.
They need government support for that. And it's very doable. And of course, he died, a year ago
or so, unfortunately.
Unsung by this society. He's a brilliant man. I think those ideas will live, however, and maybe 50 years from now, people will understand that in the 1980s, amid this horrible concentration of wealth, there was this conservative named Louis Kelso who was giving people the answer, and they just didn't hear it.
Well, one macro view of how it could be done, Lord knows we should be looking around for answers for something that can happen, and in the meanwhile we should be getting ourselves together, if I may say so, trying to get ourselves together in the face of the conditions that are really dismal and becoming more so for increasing numbers of people, and obviously so one thing we could do is read your book, if I may say so, Who Will Tell the People. William Greider has been our guest. This is subtitled Betrayal of American Democracy, out Simon & Schuster now, and of course he's the worker and the writer of the documentary recently played on public television. Happy to have been able to welcome him to the television studio here, and Bill, it's been a great talking with you. Your pleasure. We're running short of time, so I'll just say we'll see you next week, and once again, Bill Greider, thank you very much for coming in. Good night. We'll see you next week.